Good evening, everybody. For those of you on the East Coast of the United States, that is, I know that we have a number of people who are on the program throughout the United States and also internationally. I am Mark Rozelle. I am Dean of the Charter School of Policy and Government at George Mason University, and we host the Michael V. Hayden Center for Intelligence, Security, and Public Policy. I am delighted that you have decided to join on for this program. Normally, we'd be having this program at our building in Arlington, or maybe at the Ronald Reagan building, or at the National Press Club, with maybe 500 or 600 people, with a reception and an opportunity to all be together. But right now, we're doing these programs, of course, virtually. And I'm absolutely delighted that so many people have signed up for this program this evening. The Charter School of Policy and Government is one of 10 schools or colleges at George Mason University, which is the largest public university in the Commonwealth of Virginia. And we have a program, a master's degree professional program in international security studies. It has variably been rated in the top 10 in the United States. As of last year, it was ranked number 2 by US News and World Report. And we have a number of other high impact programs such as biodefense, which studies infectious diseases and now has become a really popular program for, I think, reasons that you can certainly understand. And a number of our core programs, public policy, public administration, political science, international commerce and policy, all comprise the various degree programs that we teach at the Charter School of Policy and Government at George Mason University. But for tonight, we're all about the Michael V. Hayden Center, and we're all about this particular program that really starts to kick off the almost the beginning of the new semester of programs that we're going to be doing over the course of the next academic year, where we're going to do a number of these virtual programs with the Hayden Center. So with that, I would like to introduce the Executive Director of the Hayden Center, Larry Pfeiffer, and he will introduce this evening's program. Larry?
Thank you very much, Mark. Before I continue, the first thing I want to do is extend a greeting from General Michael Hayden. He is out in the audience. If we were live at the press club or at the auditorium at the school, this is the point when he would stand up and wave to the audience and say hello. So he may be doing that in his the comfort of his home right now, but he is with us, and he sends his greeting and sends his thanks to Michael and to Russ for joining us. For those who are wondering if Russ Travers is a man on the go, that he has to do these things from his car, no, apparently we've had a horrible storm in the Washington metro area, and Russ lost power at his house, and so he's improvising by coming into us from his vehicle. So if the questions get real hard, he may just turn the engine on and take off. We'll have to see. Tonight's event is part of a series we're calling 2020 Vision. These are a series of events that are going to examine issues that we believe you as voters in the presidential election this fall should be better informed about. And so we're going to be bringing experts to you on these topics. First in the series was held last December, and it looked at the role that intelligence plays in, and the intelligence community plays in presidential elections. Michael Morell was there at that event, but we also featured former CIA Director John Brennan, former acting Director of Central Intelligence John McLaughlin, as well as acting FBI Director Andy McCabe. And if you missed that and would like to see it, you can find it on our website. You can find it on our YouTube channel. It's quite informative, made a lot of news at the time. Tonight, we're looking at terrorism. We're fast approaching, I cannot believe it, but we're fast approaching the 20th anniversary of 9/11. And we focus much of our intelligence and our national security resources on terrorism and on this fight for most of these 20 years. The Trump administration has made a pivot, emphasizing near-peer rivals like Russia, and I think we can all say especially China after some of the actions of the last couple of days. So that brings up questions, whither counterterrorism, and has this shift perhaps been at too great a cost? Is there an attention issue? Could we potentially be beginning to drive America to a situation that would mirror the pre-9/11 environment and put ourselves at risk? Guest tonight, Russ Travers, Deputy Director of the National Counterterrorism Center, NCTC, starting in November 2017. He served twice during that tenure as acting director from December 2017 through December of 18, and then again from August of 2019 until March of this year. So he really was barely ever deputy director. Russ's roots in that organization were deep. He was part of the leadership team that stood up its predecessor organization, the Terrorist Threat Integration Center, or TTIC. He was there until 2011, when he then served 2 years as the senior executive for transnational organized crime at the National Intelligence Council, or the NIC. He then moved to the White House and served the next 2 years on the National Security Council. I think we just missed each other, Russ, as senior director for transnational threat integration and information sharing. That would have filled a business card. He then returned to leadership positions at NCTC until he was nominated to be deputy director. Michael Morell, as many of you already know, he's got an outstanding 32-year career in intelligence at the Central Intelligence Agency, culminated in his service as deputy from 2010 to 13, twice serving as acting director as well. Michael has the distinction of having been with President Bush on 9/11 as his intelligence briefer, and with President Obama first when Osama bin Laden was taken down. He's the author of the bestseller, The Great War of Our Time, The CIA's Fight Against Terrorism, which was on the New York Times bestseller list. Michael serves as a distinguished fellow at our center and a visiting professor at the Schar School. Michael and Russ will begin shortly, but I do want to mention we will have a question and answer session about 40 minutes in. Please use the Q&A tool on your WebEx platform. If you're on a laptop, it's down in the lower right-hand corner. If you're on a mobile phone, I'm not 100% sure where it is, but I trust you will figure that out. When you type your question, please identify yourself. If you've got an affiliation that you'd like us to know about, put your affiliation in. Keep your questions short and to the point, and I'll return to moderate those questions later. So with that, I'm turning it over to Michael and Russ. Thank you guys very much.
Thank you, Larry, and good evening to everyone. Russ, welcome. Thank you for joining us here at the Hayden Center. And most important, it is great to talk with you again, and it's great to see you, if only virtually. I'm going to embarrass you here for a second, Russ, and tell folks that I've known you for a long time. We actually worked together for a short period of time at the National Counterterrorism Center. And when I think of Russ Travers, I think of the essence of professionalism and integrity. So Russ, thank you very, very much for joining us.
My pleasure entirely, Michael. Thank you.
So Russ, let's let me start by asking you to talk about how the threat from international terrorism has evolved since 9/11 to where it is today. I know that's a long period of time, but I think that evolution is important for people to understand.
And I agree with that. And I guess I would start by just hammering home the point that Larry made about changing priorities. If you take nothing else away from my comments tonight, my concern, what I've been trying to raise a little bit in the press, is a question of risk. What is the risk from terrorism? How much are we going to tolerate it? What should we do or not do? Are we optimally configured? And so with that as the backdrop, is a really good question to start with, because it brings together, I think, some of the complexities of almost a need to hold on to a couple of we have not had major attacks since 9/11. Even the attacks in Europe down pretty substantially. Charlie Hebdo, Al Qaeda attack, Paris and Brussels for ISIS. We have proven that we can find just about anybody on the planet given enough time. We've taken out leadership over the last 15 years pretty consistently. Obviously, bringing down the caliphate. So all of the things that we think about in terms of success, I think are what lead people to believe that maybe we can start cutting back on terrorism. Well, of course, none of this happened by accident. The country did, in fact, throw a tremendous amount of resources at the problem. We committed forces overseas and we pushed borders out. We got extraordinarily sophisticated in processing data to prevent terrorists from coming to the States. We made the Homeland pretty inhospitable. We worked with the private sector. So all of those things, I think, are to the good. Question, do we start pulling back? Because I think it's fair to say that we still got a lot of work to do. Talk a lot about a diverse and diffuse of how things have changed over time. Back when you and I were working on this together, we were primarily concerned about an externally directed threat from the Fatah. Now we still have Al-Qaeda. We still have all of the affiliates, none of them defected to ISIS. Remember, it was AQAP that tried to conduct the attack against the United States back in 2009. We see Shabab killing Americans in East Africa. They're attempting to utilize aircraft for plotting. We see them working on command and control coordination so that Shabab conducts the attack against the Dusit Hotel last year, about the same time that JNIM in West Africa conducts attack against a UN facility. They coordinate the messages. Pretty impressive. And then we see ISIS. So that evolves out of Al-Qaeda in Iraq. The caliphate is established. It's beaten down. They were very much on their back foot, to be sure, a year and a half ago. Not so much anymore. They have something like 24 branches and networks around the globe. So we need to be able to track all of this. I tend to think a lot about terrorism in the context of the downsides of globalization, the way they're using technology. Obviously, a tremendous amount of press of going dark and utilizing social media and drones, a high quality counterfeit paper that will put our border security at risk. And as we look to the future, we're going to see things like deep fakes and computer generated techniques to build weapons, all of these things that we're going to have to consider here in the next 4 or 5 years. And so it seems to me that the threat is in some ways offsetting some of those tremendous gains that we've made. And we're going to have to be thinking about this very carefully, particularly as we start to draw down forces overseas. And that leads me to kind of the threat to the homeland. I think it's a fair statement to say that the perception that the threat to the homeland has declined is what's leading people to conclude that maybe we can cut back against terrorism. I get that to a point. That's largely driven by the National Defense Strategy. If you read the National Security Strategy or the National Counterterrorism Strategy, you would get a slightly different take on what we need to be concerned about. Threats to embassies, inchoate threats that are overseas. And there is where I think there's a little bit of a disconnect in our thinking. If we look at the sort of notion of insurgencies overseas, and as they gradually climb the ladder and become threats to regional interests, you look at someplace like Mozambique, tremendous threat to oil and gas facilities there. Are we not concerned about that? We get something like 300 threats a year against embassies and consulates. Are we not concerned about those? I think we are. Perhaps most importantly, the potential growth of a threat from a regional insurgency, as it were, to a threat against the homeland. And here we need to be a little bit on the humble side. We didn't realize that AQAP was a threat to the United States back in 2009. When Umar Farouk Abdulmutallab got on Northwest Flight 253, we thought that was primarily a regional threat. Or when Faisal Shahzad tried to conduct the attack in Times Square, he was trained by TTP. We didn't realize they were sort of working through threats to the United States. So it seems to me that we've got quite a challenge here, that for certain we're most concerned about threats to the United States. But we need to think, I believe, fairly holistically about the nature of this threat, because it can evolve very quickly.
Russ, when you think about the threat to the homeland, do you primarily worry about the radicalization of people already here in the United States, as opposed to folks sending somebody here, as we saw with the Pensacola attack?
Correct. And certainly for the last several years, I think it's fair to say that That's what has concerned counterterrorism practitioners most. And up till perhaps a year or so ago, it was primarily homegrown violent extremists. And so we were probably looking at half dozen or so threats a year, attacks a year. Generally pretty small, but we saw things like Pulse nightclub or San Bernardino, large-scale threats, and killed a lot of people in the United States. Same thing is true in Europe. Their numbers are down a good bit. Question why? I think the consensus is largely that a little bit of the luster is gone from ISIS as a result of the loss of the caliphate. I think it's also fair to say that the tendency for law enforcement to move pretty quickly to preempt these sorts of threats has been true. And so we've seen that both in Europe and the United States. And in part, that's because we're getting more sophisticated about the problem. I think there's a great deal of kind of data analysis that's being used to help us detect when we're moving from radicalization to mobilization to violence. And so the HVE problem, I think, certainly bears very close watching, but it has subsided a little bit. Over the last year, year and a half, what you've heard about primarily is non-Islamist variants of strategy, of terrorism. The CT strategy from a couple of years ago explicitly said we needed to focus more on domestic terrorism. That has been around forever. We obviously had a whole string of left-wing violence in the late 60s, early 70s. We would see 6, 7 pipe bombs going off every day. We've seen right-wing violence back through the 20s, and that has been the primary concern. When I took over at NCTC, I evolved the center a little bit to be looking at some of these other non-variants of terrorism. And by far, the greatest concern is right-wing, white supremacist. And in point of fact, this is not really domestic terrorism. It's a bit of an international movement, as we've seen in the kind of manifestos of Breivik and Roof and Tarrant. I mean, they all reference one another. They sort of take energy from one another, I think. The particular challenge here is that, yes, there are groups, but this is probably kind of example of leaderless terrorism, and that is a huge challenge for our law enforcement community. And so there's no question that the FBI has the lead for this, and what we try to do at NCTC is to support them by highlighting where or not there may be international linkages.
Is there communication between these right-wing groups in the United States and overseas?
There is. I think it's fair to say that this has not been an area of great focus until recently. So I think it's a tremendous amount of internet. We see some traveling back and forth overseas, but I don't think we fully understand the nature of these connections yet. We don't actually, I think, even understand the number of incidents because absent a domestic terrorism statute, you may see a murder. You know, law enforcement treats it as murder. We don't distinguish if there's a political motivation there or not. And so the toolkit associated with domestic terrorism is still kind of inchoate. I don't think we're going to see designations. It's too hard to get around the First Amendment issues. I don't think you're going to see support charges for the same reason. And so we've got a good bit of work to do as we figure out how we're going to get left of boom and how law enforcement can begin investigations earlier. So there's a lot of work yet to be done in this arena.
So Russ, you talked earlier when you were talking about the evolution of the threat, you talked a little bit about technology. And I just want to come back to that. Do we see terrorist groups who've traditionally focused on blowing things up, thinking about using technology in attacks?
Oh, sure. I think yesterday, day before, the attacker who conducted the right-wing attack in Halle in Germany, he actually tried to build a gun off of. Didn't work very well. I think we will certainly see more of that. The sort of evolution in the use of drones from surveillance several years ago. Increasingly, we saw swarm attacks, for instance, in Iraq. We see them in a relatively nascent stage of being able to utilize explosives. And so I think it's inevitable that they tend to be early practitioners of using technology in lots of innovative ways, and almost always their ability to use technology outpaces our ability to develop the kind of legal and policy to deal, in fact, with that technology. We certainly have seen that with communications.
And do we still see an interest on the part of at least some groups in weapons of mass destruction?
We do, and I think this is probably one of the greatest concerns that I've got, in that there are a lot of directions on how to build this stuff flowing around on the web. We have seen calls to use chemical weapons, and I would say we're dealing primarily with chemical and biological, not so much nuclear now. We've seen efforts to build stuff. I mean, we saw the Al-Qaeda try to use these things many years ago, not too successfully. To some degree, I think it's been normalized by the conflict in Iraq and Syria, and so it would not surprise me at all to see poison gases. We've seen attempted ricin plots, for instance, and there's been a number of court cases associated with that in Europe.
Okay, Russ, I think it'd be great if you could give the audience a sense of what it's like to be in the shoes of a CT analyst, and to kind of talk the audience through the complexity of analyzing terrorist threats. It's probably something they haven't heard before.
Yeah, I do this with analytic groups because I think, I mean, I grew up as a Soviet analyst, and people would deal in big trends. You are a terrorism analyst is almost by definition down, because it's all about people and networks. Occasionally, we will get exemplars of sort of somebody with almost a scarlet T on them, looking like a Najibullah Zazi from a decade ago. When we get indications that we know this is a bad guy, he's going to conduct an attack, the country can surge, and we know everything there is to know about him very quickly. It is far harder when you don't know what you're looking for. And I often use the kind of metaphor of an increasingly large haystack and an ever more subtle needle. I did most of the testimony associated with 1225, and we had gotten a single report in on Umar Farouk Abdul Talib in November of 2009. All it said was his father had come into the embassy in Nigeria and said, "My son may be associated with extremists in Yemen." That's like nothing in terms of level of derogatory. But it came into my people. We put him into our terrorist identities database. It was not sufficient to watch list him. It just didn't meet the level of derogatory. It was one of 345 names that came in that particular day that was entered into TIDE, our database. And a month, 5 weeks later, he on Northwest Flight 253 and tries to blow up his underwear. Well, there were all kinds of recriminations associated with that, but this is what goes on every day. At the time, and still now, we are getting something like 10,000 names will be in those messages that the community as a whole is having to cull through. I use the metaphor with the analysts sometimes about walk into the Library of Congress, and Director Clapper used to say that we would get multiple libraries of Congress information every day. Well, reason sorting it. And there's a terrorism room someplace up on an upper floor. That's if we know it's terrorism. It's often far more subtle than that. And terrorists have to move, and they've got to communicate, and they've got to pass money. Well, those data points, they're all on different elements and different floors of the library. And there's U.S. persons information in there too. If we're talking about a sort of a transnational threat, well, we got to be careful with that data because we can't just automatically commingle it. And if we do, we have to be really careful about what we do with it. And oh yeah, there's the internet. I asked my lawyers one time, could I ingest the internet because it's all publicly available? Well, they went off and thought about it and said, no, probably not. That would be too much of an impingement on free speech. All right, that makes sense to me. But we're going to have to get that data and figure out how to bring it together, because if the electrons don't touch the electrons, there's no way we can keep up. At this morning's hearing, Chris Miller talked a little bit about artificial intelligence, and I completely agree that we need to be headed in that direction. But the problem is all that data that's coming into the Library of Congress is coming in from different departments and agencies. It's all formatted differently. Some of it's indexed, some of it's not. And so we make it, as a community, as a government, we make it really hard to for the machines to help us. It's hard to train them because the data all looks different. And all of this information has just a myriad of different equities: policy, privacy, legal, technical, and yet we have got to deal with all that information. Some of it resides in entirely separate stovepipes. There is no place in this government where all financial data comes together, because they've got particular constraints on their information. And so that's an acceptance of risk. It makes us fairly clunky at dealing with information. So one of the things that I was hoping was going to occur in our overall evaluation of the community was we need to bring some really smart techies in from Silicon Valley to start making some recommendations for us, because we're spending more money on our IT architectures than anything else. And while I am a huge fan of what we used to call iSight and moving things to the cloud, in effect, what we're doing is replicating silos in the cloud. And so we haven't necessarily made it all that much easier for ourselves. And so this is what our analysts have got to go through. And unfortunately, the amount of data that keeps coming in, there's probably a lot of work we have to do on what can we or can't we do with publicly available information. How much can brokers sell to the government? I mean, I think there are some really significant Fourth Amendment questions here that need to be worked.
So Russ, you kicked this whole thing off by expressing your concern about where we're headed with resources vis-a-vis the threat. How well postured do you think we are today to deal with the threat? Are we already taking on more risk, or is it more of a future concern that you have?
I think it's probably more of a future concern. I worry that we're reacting to kind of current trends, and as I say, I don't expect to see a large attack against the Homeland tomorrow. I think the operational community has done brilliant work in buying us space and time to deal with underlying problems. I do think this community is already feeling pressure. As Larry indicated, the move to great powers is causing all departments and agencies to move people away from terrorism to these other problem sets. I think that's both understandable and appropriate. We are also seeing a pretty significant cuts over the years at NCTC, and that, as I've said numerous times in the press, does concern me, because we could end up, I fear, with going back to a bit of the same structures that we had before. I mean, all departments and agencies were doing counterterrorism before then, and yet we didn't succeed. Now, maybe we can argue that We've fixed all of our information sharing and all of our integrative shortcomings that existed before 9/11, and therefore you don't need a robust NCTC like we did perhaps 10 or 15 years ago. I'm personally not convinced of that. It does feel to me that as there's less focus on terrorism, there's certainly far less interest in it downtown. We don't have the kinds of meetings that we had. We don't have the sort of expertise and high level sort of significant counterterrorism experts at the White House that we used to have. Again, that's understandable. But who is it that's going to worry this problem constantly and ensure that a border security system that, well, extraordinarily good at responding to the 9/11 problem, probably isn't as good responding to a threat whereby the bad guys are using increasingly capable for counterfeit cards and passports and identity to a names-based system. So in my opinion, we need to be almost thinking about this from the perspective of where we were 15 years ago and updating it to account for the threat. I guess I don't see that that kind of effort is ongoing, in part because we're trying to figure out risk equation kinds of questions.
Yeah. So your concerns got you into some hot water. Can you kind of share with us what happened?
We were on our third DNI, and within 7 months, so there was some turmoil, I think, at LX to begin with. We were in the midst of a review because it seemed to me that we needed to take a hard look at the counterterrorism enterprise, where we were sort of well off, where we had duplication, where we could afford to make cuts and so forth. We've been going through that process for quite a while.
Was this just focused on NCTC, or was it focused on?
Initially, it was focused on the counterterrorism intelligence enterprise writ large. And I think the bottom line was that most of the departments and agencies felt like they wanted to be largely left alone. I mean, I think that as a general proposition, the departments and agencies, particularly the all source organizations, wanted to be able to be on the record for whatever it was, future of ISIS, future Al-Qaeda, that they felt the need to have a record assessment that represented their organization. I personally don't think we can afford that any longer. I mean, I think we should be operating more as an enterprise. And so I was pushing for things like a level of matrix management or a level of division of labor. Now, in truth, we've tried these before. They haven't worked very well. But as Director Clapper used to say, we're running out of money. We're going to have to start to think. I think that was absolutely right. And so it's fair to say that I was, I think, protective of NCTC and making some noises about my concerns that we weren't getting the level of support from the departments and agencies, because we largely are a detailee-oriented organization. And we also were, I thought, at risk for not being able to process electrons. Our IT budget is relatively small by comparison. We're just not that large an organization. The departments and agencies, I think, were not convinced by my arguments. They felt that maybe I was not objective, and so they wanted to have an external body take a look at NCTC to see if we were coloring within the lines, were we being true to our foundational documents. I actually thought that was a great idea, because I was pretty sure that an external objective group would conclude that NCTC was still important and relevant, and that we had some problems. That's exactly what happened. So we had, under Director Coates' auspices, he brought in a group that included a former deputy director of NSA, a former chairman of the HIPC, a former head of counterterrorism at the FBI, a former counterterrorism Homeland Security guy for President Trump. So a bunch of luminaries came in and looked at NCTC specifically. And they said, ooh, you know, NCTC is still critical. It's got some work to do. I mean, they dinged us on our strategic planning function. They thought that had atrophied. But they also said we needed to take a look at both the how NCTC was being staffed, because our detailees are 35% down from where it was a few years ago. We were already 15% lower than we'd been after 1225. And so that study was done. Unfortunately, it didn't get any traction. I think the departments and agencies, again, weren't convinced or whatever. And similarly, Director Grinnell he accepted none of the recommendations that were made in that study. And so he further cut NCTC. I don't know. I have no personal insight into exactly why I was fired. All I know is I went into a meeting expecting to talk to him about NCTC. They did know, the front office at ODNI did know that I'd been to the Inspector General to raise some of my concerns, that there was a cognitive dissonance between the statutory mandate of the center and what I thought I was able to do. So whether that information was relevant or not, I don't know, but I went into the meeting as the acting director and I was told that I was no longer. And importantly, Pete Hall, who was my deputy, NSA had graciously allowed their counterterrorism chief to come down and be my deputy. The decision to remove me also involves sending Pete back to NSA. So that was disappointing, to be sure. I should say that I was exceptionally pleased that they went through a little bit of turmoil figuring out who was going to be the next acting director. Some people talked to me about it, decided not to take it. But at the end of the day, Laura Shao and Claire Linkins, who were two of the seniors from NCTC, fleeted up. That was an incredibly good thing for the center. The workforce knows and trusts them. They are pros. And so the leadership thing for me was largely resolved.
Well, thanks, Russ, for sharing that. Larry, let's go to questions. I think it's a good time to make the transition.
Okay, hope everyone, you can all hear me. So, excuse me. First question I got here kind of also focuses a little bit on some of the more tickly matters of the moment. This one is from a former CIA officer, David Kreese, who has been a guest of the Hayden Center in the past. He would like to know this question. A newly revealed and unclassified Department of expanded collection and reporting on domestic threats to monuments and statues. What reaction do you have to the development, and how would you have reacted while NCTC acting director if you'd received an order to direct NCTC efforts at this by treating protesters defacing statues as terrorists? So I think we're having some difficulty hearing and seeing Russ. Yeah, Russ, we are not hearing or seeing you at the moment. I don't know if you would want to maybe disconnect and reconnect, and while we're waiting for you to do that, perhaps Michael, you would want to entertain that question?
Sure, I'd love to entertain that question. Right, if a group is not designated as a foreign terrorist organization, then the United States intelligence community would have no business being involved in that in any way, and any leader of integrity that I know would push back hard on any request to involve the intelligence community in such an effort.
Great. Let's try Russ. Just want to see if you're there, if you're hearing us or seeing us. No, it does not look like we're having much success with Russ there. Russ, if you can hear me, perhaps you'd want to disconnect and then perhaps try to reconnect. I think we may have to improvise a little bit more here, Michael.
Sure.
You've written a great book on the war on terror and Al-Qaeda and ISIS, and we've got some questions that relate to that. Obviously, you don't have any immediate insights into intelligence information on these subjects. But one question we got was the question of core Al-Qaeda. Where do we believe we stand in the fight against the core Al-Qaeda that, you know, took down the towers and attacked the Pentagon?
Sure. It still exists. It's mostly in Afghanistan. And this is why the Afghan question is so important. I do not believe the Taliban when it says that it will work to prevent Al-Qaeda from conducting attacks. I think they're telling us what, I think the Taliban is telling us what we want to hear. I think they believe that we are leaving, and they're trying to do everything they can to encourage us to do so, and telling us that they will deal with Al-Qaeda is one of those. And even if they were willing to say to Al-Qaeda, you can't conduct attacks from Afghanistan, I have real questions about the Taliban's capability in doing that. So, look, I'm concerned about not Al-Qaeda tomorrow, but I'm concerned about Al-Qaeda 3 or 4 years from now, after we leave Afghanistan and the Taliban retake the country, and Al-Qaeda has safe haven again. I start worrying about them.
That's great. We're continue to wait for Russ. I think you and I could just continue to have a conversation.
Yeah, I'd make, you know, the one comment I would make about Russ's history is that, in my experience, there's been, you know, the terrorism threat has gone through sort of a sine wave. You know, the threat rises, and we see it, and we deal with it. And when we deal with it successfully, then the threat declines. And then we sort of take our eyes off of it, as we did when we went to Iraq and left Afghanistan, in part. The threat rose again. And so by 2005, 2006, Al-Qaeda was back to where it was in September 10th, 2001. And so you get these waves. And the reason you get the waves is because actually degrading a terrorist organization is a pretty easy thing to do. But once you take your focus off of it, it's pretty easy to rebuild a terrorist organization, which is why you get these waves. And I think, you know, my concern is with a loss of focus on terrorism. And, you know, obviously there needs to be some resource reallocation, but too many resources flowing away from it, we are going to see a rebound in the threat. This fight is not over. This war is not over. They're going to come at us again. And so we might be in a low threat period right now, but the very thing that Russ is describing is going to lead to a reemergence of the threat, without a doubt.
Right. Now, a lot of folks, and we talked a little bit about this a moment ago with, or tried to with Russ, but the question of domestic terrorism. There's clearly a rise of violence across the United States, a good part of it attached to some form of ideology. So that raises questions about you know, the commitment of counterterrorism resources against that, and you addressed that a little while ago. But some of the other questions we've gotten have related to issues of what could the foreign terrorists be learning from watching some of this activity take place in our country. You know, people have referenced in their questions school shootings or protest activities that, you know, that's taking place in some of our cities today.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, right? I mean, when I was involved in a fight against international terrorism, you know, I often wondered why they didn't take 10 guys and put them in 10 different malls across the United States with AK-47s, and on a Saturday afternoon, just kill as many people as possible. Right. And, you know, I think that they don't fully understand us. You know, it's not easy to understand another country, another culture. You actually have to work at it. So I'm not sure that they fully understand the damage that they would do with such a scenario. And, you know, I think we're kind of lucky that they're focused, or have been focused, right, on large scale catastrophic attacks, because it would be a heck of a lot easier to to do a series of smaller attacks that did real damage.
So hopefully you didn't give them some great ideas just then. Yeah,
We got to get people in. So
we got another great question that I know you can touch upon, Michael. This one comes from Dr. Ryan McCoy. He's an adjunct professor at the Carter School at George Mason University. He asks a question based on a Pentagon briefing that he heard yesterday. They mentioned a new emphasis on fighting the ideology. And they were wondering if we could perhaps talk a little bit about that. Now, you know, you and I go way back in this war on terrorism, and this notion of fighting the ideology is something that has always been discussed. So, you know, what is fighting the ideology, and what could they possibly mean that we need to give it a new emphasis?
yeah. So this is a hard one. General Hayden used to talk about the near fight and the far fight, right? And the near fight was dealing with those terrorists who already existed and were trying to kill you. And that's what we've gotten really good at since 9/11. That's what Russ said, right? We've gotten really good at finding those people and dealing with them and protecting ourselves from them. That far fight, right, is how do you prevent the creation of terrorists in the first place? And we are not very good at that. We're not very good at that for, I think, two reasons. One is the focus has always been, understandably so and rightly so, on stopping those people who are trying to attack you, right? If a couple of gang members were trying to break into your home at night and hurt your family, your entire focus would be on stopping them. The last thing you would do is stop and think about the socioeconomic conditions that created the gang in the first place, right? And so the focus has been on protecting ourselves. But the other reason is it's not something the United States can do on its own, right? This is, in fact, the United States would even have a hard time leading it because the creation of terrorists, you know, occurs for all sorts of different reasons: socioeconomic, political, you know, disaffection from your community, but also religious, right? A bastardization of Islam by people who are using it to entice others to join them in this fight, and they're making an argument about the religion that just isn't true, and they're using it against people who aren't well educated in the religion. So the religion is part of this, and the U.S. has absolutely no standing, right, in talking about religious issues inside Islam. So it's very, very hard for us to do. At the end of the day, it has to be Muslim leaders, it has to be Muslim teachers, it has to be Muslim clerics, right, who really get their arms around the religious piece of it. We can help with the socioeconomic stuff and the political stuff, but the religious stuff is really hard.
So it sounds like the Pentagon has their work cut out for them.
Yeah, I don't think it's going to happen.
Yeah. I'm going to pivot again to another subject here. We've had a number of people ask this question. One individual, Robert Alberts. How would you assess the future of Iraq, its government's ability to prevent the rise of Sunni extremists? Some other questions have also talked about, you know, how dead is ISIS really? And then how does the Iraqi government get control as well over the Shia militia? You know, multi-pronged problems in that country. And I didn't even bring up the incredible influence of Iran in that country as well. But with Iraq, where are we with Iraq?
Yeah, I think you know, it's going to be a continuous struggle for the Iraqi government, and I am deeply concerned that if the United States were to leave, if the coalition were to leave Iraq, if we can't work out an agreement for us to stay, then I don't believe the Iraqi security forces will be able to prevent a resurgence of ISIS. You know, we already see ISIS reconstituting. I think if the United States was not there, we would see a resurgence. In not too dissimilar a way to what happened when we left Iraq in 2011. Interestingly, in 2011, when we left, it wasn't just the fact that U.S. forces weren't there anymore. The Iraqi government, in wanting to show its sovereignty, decided that it wouldn't even work with U.S. military or wouldn't even work with U.S. intelligence for a period of time. And that's when you saw the immediate rebound of al-Qaeda in Iraq that eventually became ISIS just a year later or so. So, you know, I think the Iraqi government has a tough road ahead. You know, it's walking a fine line between the West and Iran. Its security forces are still not up to the job, and they still need a lot of help. And if they don't get it, then we're going to be the ones to pay part of that price.
So, you know, when you do these events in person, it's harder for the person to leave the stage. But when you do them virtually, I guess they could just bail when the questions are going to start to get really interesting. No, actually, I kid. I am sure Russ is feeling horrible about his inability to reconnect with us. So I apologize to the audience, and I appreciate the 264 of you that are still sticking with us.
And
Thank you very much.
Apologize to the journalists who all signed in, hoping they'd be able to ask Russ questions.
Right. Got another question again. This very similar to the last question. This one comes from Suleiman Ozeran, who's one of another professor here at Shar School. How do you see the conflict in Libya becoming a hotbed for a potential proxy war between non-state actors and outside actors? And what should the U.S. be doing differently with regards to Libya to avoid, you know, another emergence of an ISIS-like organization?
Yeah, well, there is proxy. Is Russ back?
Is he?
Maybe not.
No.
There is a proxy war in Libya. There are nation states who have different groups who are supporting different groups. So there's absolutely a proxy war underway. You know, it looks like that proxy war is swinging in favor of the government that is recognized by the West. Look, I think we, the United States, abdicated our responsibility here with Libya. We helped break this, literally, and I think we had a responsibility to help shape events. Now, that does not necessarily mean militarily. We have incredibly capable diplomats, and I think there was numerous opportunities for diplomatic intervention in Libya that just didn't happen. And the differences in Libya were left to be fought over with guns, and that's very, very unfortunate. But I do, you know, the bigger picture here is that of all the places in the world that I worry about, and I think if Russ were on, he would agree with me. Of all the places in the world that I worry about in terms of a terrorist threat that could reach out and touch us, it would be Africa. So al-Qaeda is doing very well in Africa, and ISIS is doing very well in Africa. Some of those people can easily find their way to Europe, and those people potentially could find their way to the United States. Certainly US targets in Europe, but even potentially find their way to the United States. And so I think we have to be deeply concerned about what's going on in Africa with regard to terrorism.
So we were talking a little bit earlier about the evolution of the use of technology by terrorists over time. And well, you did get a question here from Bob Scalar. Do we potentially see the use of technology evolving to perhaps a complete virtual use of technology, perhaps terrorists embracing cyber in a significant fashion? So wondered if you could address the role cyber may be playing in terrorism, both I think in terms of offense from the terrorists, but perhaps how we, the U.S., could be utilizing cyber in our defense.
Yeah, so, you know, when I was in government, that is not something we worried about. You know, it was terrorists like to blow things up, and they like to kill people that way. That speaks the loudest in terms of their interests. That's how we perceived them. That's how we interpreted what they were doing. And so we never worried about terrorists using cyber to conduct attacks, right? To damage networks, to damage critical infrastructure, or what have you. The reason I asked Russ the question about technology was because of his reference to it, right? In his early comments, Russ made it sound as if that is something we need to worry about. So I find that very interesting. I wish he was still here to tell us even more about this, but if Russ is worried about it, then I'm worried about it because he's got much more recent access to the intelligence than I do. So maybe I need to update my view a little bit here.
Right. So we're looking forward to a presidential election this fall, and we're going to, either have Donald Trump reelected and many of the same players remaining in place. We could have Joe Biden elected, and he may be bringing new players in. Either way, it presents opportunities to look at how the counterterrorism fight is structured and organized. And if you were Michael Morell, if you were given a piece of paper and a pen and said, blue sky, how would you organize our counterterrorism effort moving forward? What kinds of things would you do the same and would you do differently?
I'm laughing a little bit because you'll remember that when General Hayden was the principal deputy director of national intelligence, that basically he handed me that piece of paper, and I helped create the NCTC of today in terms of its size as an organization, particularly analytically, and its focus, its analytic focus, which is broad and deep, right, on all terrorism issues. So, I think there is absolutely a role for NCTC. I think we might want to think a little bit about what we ask them to do, and do we ask them to do everything that DIA is doing in terms of force protection for the U.S. military in terms of counterterrorism, and do we ask them to do everything that CIA does in terms of threats to U.S. interests, both overseas and at the homeland? Or do we ask them, to be a little bit more narrow and to make sure that nothing falls in that seam between domestic and international, right? That seam that we missed with 9/11. Do we say we need you to focus on that? And so I think it's worth a discussion about NCTC's role. But I don't know at the end of the day if the answer would be any different than what I designed, long ago, or what it sounds like this outside group said, you're doing the right things.
Well, we've hit 8 o'clock. We did not get Russ back, and I have not heard from him. So I'm guessing he ran into some real technical glitches as a result of these storms. I want to thank you, Michael, for moderating and for pivoting to be the guy answering the questions through the last 20 minutes. Thank you very much. For those of you who have been participating and stuck with us, thank you very much. This WebEx platform, I've got a lot of queries from folks about audio problems, either not getting any audio at all or having some of the garbles that we had. I apologize for that. I promise our next on Zoom, which I think is a little more user-friendly. We do have Zoom licenses now at the Hayden Center and the Shar School, so stay tuned. We'll be doing more events. Mark said we're going to kind of accelerate our pace. Hoping to have 1 or 2 in August, and then roll on September, October. So pay attention to our website, pay attention to our social media, pay attention to our YouTube channel. And with that, I will close the event and say again, thank you for everyone for attending.